How's it going, my stereo hi-fi heads? My name is Clint Hoagland, and this is Creating Electronic Music with ChucK. In video 12, we talked about panning and how you can make your music more immersive by filling out your stereo field. In our last video, we talked about controlling our dynamics using the Dyno ugen, and specifically we talked about how to use the Dyno ugen to keep your sounds from clipping. I said in that tutorial that the next video was going to be about subclassing and inheritance, but instead I'm going to share a quick tip I learned about stereo processing and put that inheritance discussion off until next time. Now, if you followed the advice in the last tutorial and used the Dyno ugen as a limiter, here is a problem you might have encountered. Your audio gets collapsed back down into mono when it goes through the Dyno ugen. This is actually a problem that I kind of try to work around in the panning tutorial by putting the panner at the end of the signal chain. If you listen carefully to the sound, the tail of the reverb is getting panned around the stereo field. It's subtle, but if you pay attention, it is noticeable. I thought that was a little weird, but I figured it was just sort of a quirk of ChucK that we had to live with. Turns out that's not the case. I found a cool trick while lurking around in the example files that come with the ChucK install. As far as I can tell, this is not mentioned anywhere in the ChucK docs, nor is it in the ChucK book. Let's look at that panning script. We've got an oscillator going into an envelope, going into a reverb, going into a pan 2, going into the DAC. The pan 2 is last, and I'll show you why. Here I've written some logging statements that access each of my ugen's channels property. Let me run this script real quick, and now let's look at what it spit out. What we see here is that oscillators have one channel, ADSRs have one channel, and reverbs have one channel, and then pan 2s have two channels, and so does the DAC. It's actually the case that almost all ChucK ugens have only one channel. That is to say that they are almost all mono processors. That means that if you chuck stereo sound into them, what comes out is mono sound. Like I said before, I was kind of working around that, and it was basically tolerable right up until we arrived at the solution of using a limiter to control clipping. You want that at the end of your signal chain, right before the DAC. But Dynos too are mono processors. How are you supposed to keep your audio from clipping without also collapsing into mono? Here's the trick. What I found out is, if you make an array of two mono processors, and you chuck a stereo ugen into that array, ChucK will automatically chuck the first channel of your stereo ugen into the first ugen in that array, and the second channel of your stereo ugen into the second channel of the array. Likewise, if you chuck a two-element array of ugens into a stereo ugen, such as the DAC, it gets treated as if the first ugen was the left channel and the second ugen was the right channel. This means that if you want a stereo processor in ChucK, all you gotta do is make it into a two-element array. Note, you will have to chuck values to both processors. The most convenient way I know of to do that is to chuck a value to the first ugen in the array, and then, because the result of chucking a value to a ugen is just that value again, you can chuck that straight into the next ugen in the array. So here I've got that same panning demo, but this time I put the reverb after the panner. I made the reverb a two-member array, and I set its value like so. I also added a call to the .op property here so that it's easy to turn off. I also added a limiter array after the reverb, which, as you can see, is currently turned off. Let's listen to how it sounds. See, that subtle jumping around of the reverb tail is gone, and now you can hear the reverb decaying like it should, across the stereo field. To make it more obvious, I'll turn on these limiters to beef up the reverb tails. Note that, as promised, it's still in stereo. In this tutorial, we talked about how to use arrays to allow for stereo processing in ChucK. In our next tutorial, we'll talk about subclasses and inheritance, unless I think of something else to do first.